I'd like to welcome you all today to our webinar on Pimelea and its management. As you no doubt be aware, the season that we've been having has, particularly across southern and southwestern Queensland, caused a fair germination of Pimelea, and it's something that most of us have been dealing with for a number of years. I think we have some people from the Central West as well, so we've got quite a geographical spread today. Just a little bit of background to this webinar, apart from the fact that it's obviously timely to be covering this topic. This particular webinar is being jointly put on by Leading Sheep, and also through two projects that myself and Alex and a few others are involved with as well, which are co-funded between the state and federal governments, both the Capable and Confident Women's Project and the Young Beef and Sheep Producers Project. So we've brought this webinar jointly between those three projects. Our presenter for today is Jenny Milson. Many of you from the West will know Jenny. She's very, very well known throughout Western Queensland in many things related to plants, and as a rangeland scientist, she's had quite a lot of experience with Pimelea, so we're lucky to have Jenny with us today to run us through the presentation. And in addition to that, many of you will be aware that there was a significant Pimelea project run a couple of years ago, and Mary Fletcher is also on the line with us today, and she actually led that project, and also Richard Silcock, who led up one component of that, the ecology sub-project. So they'll be available to answer some of the specific questions of the components of the project that they were working with. So we've got a pretty experienced panel with us today.
Thanks, Kay. Right. Well, we'll get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining in the afternoon. Sorry we're a bit late getting underway, but it looks like we're all connected now, so that's good. I'll not pretend anything. This is the first webinar I've actually presented at, so if we have some hiccups, you can blame me. But I'll just I'll go through, and I'll really encourage you to, if you've got a nagging question, put your hand up. If I don't notice it straight away because I'm concentrating on what I'm talking about, Greg Barth, who's the host, probably will, and he'll give me a nudge somehow and butt in and make sure that I take notice. So we'll get started. Pimelea poisoning is something that I guess we're all here to learn about. So mainly affects cattle, and also what we find is that it tends to grow in wet winters. So this year, even though there was a fair amount of summer rain, there is some Pimelea coming up in certain areas. But we particularly noticed it the end of 2005 and for quite a number of years following that the dry summers followed by wet winters were ideal for Pimelea because there wasn't competition, and plus they were getting the wet winters. So I won't go into a lot of the clinical signs, but some of the problems that are associated with Pimelea is if they eat it green, they can get severe intestinal irritation and diarrhoea, and this shows up also, the diarrhoea also shows up with St. George disease, which is the more, I guess, recognised problem that people actually notice specifically when there's fluid swellings under the neck, jaw, brisket, and sometimes the belly as well. Loss of condition, reduced appetite, often a distended jugular vein and a prominent pulse. And I remember those of you who may know Bob Cottam, who used to be the vet out here in Longreach and across Western Queensland, and he said that you could stand quite a few yards away and literally hear the pulse. So that was something that stood out for him. And the animals often appear quite depressed as well. The appetite's lost, I've mentioned that. And often they'll stand alone from the mob, just looking a bit depressed like that poor old one sitting there on the left-hand side. Okay, I'll just have a quick look at some of the main species. We've got a nice scattering of people across Queensland this afternoon, so that's really good. So some of you will have been more familiar with a particular species than another. So the one that we're just looking at on the screen now is Pimelea trichostachya, or flaxweed. I'll let you know now. I'll probably talk about the scientific names a little bit because the common names vary a little bit across the areas. So it's generally called flaxweed in some places, but I'll probably refer to this as Trichostachya as we go throughout the presentation from now on as one of the three main species that we're talking about. But Pimelea Trichostachya typically likes the sandy soils, varying colour, as well as some of the hard-setting duplex soils. And often it's got always it's got that longer seed head on it, usually about 5 to 7 centimetres long. Sometimes can grow a lot longer than that. So that's Pimelea Trichostachya, and many of you online this afternoon will have that. Pimelea simplex is more closely associated with heavy clay soils and more alkaline soils, and some of the red desert loams as well. And often there's substantial stone and gibber cover too, and this particular photo is taken out at Boulia, but it likes the Gidgee country sort of west of Longreach that I'm most familiar with, but it does grow on clay soils in a lot of other areas as well. And that's its typical seed head. It's a shorter seed head, usually no more than about 2 centimetres, and the flowers are more clustered towards the top there. Okay, Pimelea elongata, or lakebed Pimelea. This is the one that usually is associated with margins and claypans or localised gilguys, little ephemeral lake beds. It's fairly adaptable to many, and typically it's got the longer flower head too. It's not quite as hairy as the Pimelea Trichostachya that we looked at before. Just no need to take too much notice of this, I suppose, but it just gives a bit of an idea of the distribution of the Pimelea species throughout Australia. And the yellow ones are Pimelea simplex, the blue is Pimelea Trichostachya, and the red is Pimelea elongata. So, particularly across the eastern states, I suppose, but some locations in West Australia as well. Okay, so how do we go about having our animals poisoned? So, and I'll talk a bit more detail about these, but just to go through them quickly. Ingestion of green material. So if the animals are really hungry and there's a lot of Pimelea around, if there's not much else, they may be forced to eat it. They generally don't like the smell or the taste of Pimelea, so in most circumstances they will avoid it if they possibly can. Sometimes if it's growing up through other feed or it's the same height as some other herbaceous, producers have told me that they will eat it as a mix with palatable feed. There are some producers out here I know that when the Pimelea is at a different height, cattle seem to be able to select away from it, even if it is growing fairly well mixed through. But really, really good to be aware of when you've got it and keeping an eye on stock if they're in those paddocks. Ingestion of dried fragments. So again, at this stage they're probably not going to be able to smell it very well, so it's really difficult to avoid it for the animals. So the picture on the right hand side here shows that's a Pimelea plant growing up right through a mitchell grass tussock. So we've got a mitchell grass tussock and then that dried plant coming up through it, and you can actually just see the little seed heads, the little seeds still attached at the top there. So an animal's going to take a bite of a mitchell grass plant there and also take in that dried off Pimelea plant. And also possibly, if they're ingesting some soil that's containing some of the dried fragments, and these are little dried fragments down here of Pimelea plants. So if they inadvertently pick up a bit of soil with those fragments, those particular fragments showing there are obviously going to be too big, but there are probably smaller ones associated with that. Inhalation has always been a question that people ask, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. But basically, if the dried fragments are inhaled, they are then subsequently ingested, and then they can affect the animal as if the animal had eaten the plant itself. Okay, so what research has been done? A few years ago, we were fortunate enough to get some funding, which Mary Fletcher, who Kay introduced before, led the project. It was funded by Natural Heritage Trust, and it was funded through AgForce. AgForce had really picked up that over the year prior, around 2005, that Pimelea had actually cost the industry over $50 million. And that's not just with, animal deaths, but also all the extra associated costs with people having to send them away on adjustment and that sort of thing. They were pretty keen to get something happening, so we were supportive with them. It was driven by Queensland DPINF, that was then, we're now Department of Employment, Economic Development and Innovation, as you may know, and received collaboration from those people as well, or those organisations, and also in-kind contribution from MLA and AA Company. So between us all, we were able to get going. So I'll talk about some of the results and then some of the implications that those results have in terms of management and what we can do. Mary was able to develop a liquid chromatograph mass spectrometer. I should have got Mary to say that, but anyway, I had it written down there, so LCMS is much easier to handle. And that was analysis to actually assess the toxin in both plant and animal tissues. They knew some years ago, but with this research we're able to better measure it, that the main toxin in Pimelea is simplexin, and that there are also other related compounds, but they're at lower levels than simplexin. And over the course of the project, there was analysis done of more than 600 plant samples, and looking at the toxin levels of the different species, so we looked at the 3 different species, the stages of growth, so when they were green, seeding when they dried off, and also looking at different soil types and the different exposure to weathering, so how toxin changes over time under natural conditions of weathering. You don't have to remember this and go and write it down, but that's just to show you the chemical structure of simplexin, and that it actually is a fat-soluble toxin. So what that means for us is that the simplexin itself doesn't leach readily into water. So if you've got Pimelea seeds that are falling into drainage lines, the simplexin toxin isn't actually going to leach into the water. However, if the animals do happen to ingest the seeds, so they're drinking water with seeds in them, they can still receive the toxin that way. But I found that quite interesting, that the actual toxin itself doesn't leach into the water. Okay, the toxin level results. So some of the stuff that, Mary's work found out was that from the field material, so material that came in that was collected out in the paddock from a number of locations, the toxin level was highest in the flowers and the seeds of the plants. It was also highest in the plant roots, but the animals probably aren't going to access that very easily. In terms of species, the toxin levels were higher in Pimelea elongata and Trichostachya than they were in Pimelea simplex. Doesn't mean that they're going to be poisoned more by those two. It's just what the levels of the toxin are, and we'll talk a little bit more about conditions under which those animals may be poisoned. Highest at the pre-flowering and early flowering stages. So in terms of actually when the plants are most toxic, that is when. And as the plant gets older, the toxin level declines. So when you've got those really dried up plants that we looked at before in that slide, the levels of the toxin are quite low in most of the plant. However, the seed material does maintain the toxin levels. Interesting too that tests of dust associated with the Pimelea plants showed negligible levels of the toxin. Okay, so we also had, and you can see down here, this little slide down here, these were little mesh bags where we had specimens of Pimelea seed and leaf litter material in these little bags, and we put those out in the paddocks at various sites throughout, they're in South Australia, New South Wales, and 2 in Queensland, 1 south of Mitchell and 1 west of here. And so we've been able to look at by digging those up, we had some buried, so we dug those up, and by collecting some of the others that were on the surface, each over various time intervals, we were able to actually look at how the toxin levels varied over time under natural weathering conditions. So what it showed was that the Pimelea seed showed little decline in toxin levels over 18 months, and that the leaf and stem material showed significant decline over the same time. So, yeah, the toxin is declining in the plant as a whole, but not in the seed material. So the seed remains, the implications for that is that the seed does remain toxic for longer periods of time, so it can, if the animals do somehow ingest that seed, they are going to be toxic. I guess too that the plants are most toxic when they're flowering or young. However, they're usually avoided then because of the smell and the taste of the plant, which I talked about before, unless the animals are really hungry. And the other way they'll be ingested, of course, is if the stock are not able to separate it from palatable material. And even though Pimelea elongata contains the most toxin, it seems to cause few poisonings, presumably because it's often growing in isolated populations, so animals will actually be grazing in different areas and grazing palatable material from other areas, so they're not going to get it mixed up with Pimelea elongata. Plants are, as I mentioned before, not as easily avoided when they're growing up through the palatable species or when dry. And even though the toxin levels are lower in dry Pimelea material, animals are more likely to eat it inadvertently, and in so doing, they can still consume enough to cause poisoning. I mean, if you're drinking half rums all night, you'll still get drunk if you have enough of them. So I guess it's just saying even if it's diluted, the toxin's not as much there. If you eat enough of it, can still be effective. And also remembering that the seeds are remaining high in toxin, and if they're remaining attached to the dried plants, they can still ingest it that way. Okay, again, Mary was handling this project, but I'll just give you a summary of it. I had a feeding trial of 460 kg calves at Animal Research Institute in Brisbane, and they were fed an increasing amount of milled dried Pimelea trichostachya with a measured toxin content. Now, I think that toxin content was about 200 parts per million. Mary, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But basically, they measured it at about 2 grams of Pimelea per day per animal, and I'll just get this arrow. This slide down here is actually showing you about the amount that those animals were being fed at the start. So that's just showing it's not very much over time of what those animals, they don't have to eat much to be getting that amount of 2 grams per day. So those doses of Pimelea were gradually increased to greater than 5 grams of Pimelea per day, but over time the clinical signs actually decreased over several months. So the animals were showing, I think the first animal showed clinical signs after about 35 days, and then the other animals also showed clinical signs. So they were showing some mild edema and also diarrhea at various. The diarrhea appeared at various times through the trial. The mild edema commenced at the doses of 2 grams. There we go. We all developed diarrhea at various times. So the autopsy of those animals showed that there was some evidence of pulmonary venual constriction. So the muscles the muscles in those venules are affected by the toxin, and that's what actually causes the problem, that the heart can't operate as it normally does. But I guess the key thing here is that over time, even though the animals were being fed slightly increased levels of Pimelea per day, the clinical signs did decrease over several months, so that at the end of it, the animals were actually almost back to normal, or I think they were back to normal. Mary can correct me later on. I'm pretty sure they were back to normal after 91 days. And I guess, I'll further that discussion shortly, but that was significant part of the trial. So over time, they developed some means of dealing with that toxin, and it seemed that these were non-stressed animals that hadn't been exposed to Pimelea before. When they were initially only eating small amounts of Pimelea, it seems that they can develop a tolerance of simplexin, and maybe it's via a gradual modification of the rumen microflora. So something in the rumen is building up enough of a population that, and it's a suitable microflora that it can handle simplexin.
Jenny, it's Tony Hamilton here. You know the slide you had up where the plant was in amongst the Mitchell grass?
Yeah.
Is it?
I'll just go back and find it.
Is there a very high percentage of those sort of plants in amongst the Mitchell grass, or is it, only a very low amount, or does it vary in the season, in the good season or the drier seasons, the amount of Pimelea that's in amongst the Mitchell grass?
This photo was actually taken out at Boulia, and also a similar case at outside Longreach a few years ago. I think I've got to recap on your question, but I think what was it common? In those paddocks, it was very common. Very common. And we do find it with Pimelea simplex on these gidgy soils. That is something that is quite common on the properties that are being affected. Sorry, did you have another aspect to your question there, Tony?
I just wondered whether it varied much in the, like drought years compared to good seasons, whether you got more of it or less of it.
Oh, okay. Good question. These places had dry summers, but they still had quite good, they had very healthy pastures and they had healthy Mitchell grass tussocks. The key was that they did get the winter rain, which brought the Pimelea simplex up on a variety of, especially in the disturbed areas where the other two species grow best in disturbed areas, but even where the Mitchell grass country was healthy and undisturbed, the Pimelea simplex plants were coming up through the middle of it. It seemed to be that the wet winter was just ideal for Pimelea germination that year. And it didn't happen on a lot of properties, Tony, and it didn't happen on a lot of, it certainly didn't happen on a lot of land types. It was fairly specific to the Mitchell grass going on Gidgee stone country.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Okay, I'll just find where I was. Yes,
could I add for Tony's benefit that the Trichostachya type comes up very commonly amongst bufflegrass pastures, very healthy bufflegrass pastures. So the plants being mixed in with perennial grass pastures that are relatively dormant in winter is quite a common thing.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, because I hadn't actually seen it. I probably haven't seen enough of the other species growing up through buffle. So that's very interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. Mary also did some tests to see if there was see if she could detect toxin in the animal tissue. The machine that she has can actually detect toxin if it is present in the animal tissue. But what they found was that there was no toxin detected in these feeding trial animal tissue, and also no residual toxin levels recorded in meat that was collected from a small number of Pimelea-affected paddock animals. And that's good news for those sending animals to slaughter in terms that there are no toxin residues. It does make some of the research harder because sometimes we want to be able to look at, had some animals been affected in the past, could we tell by looking at the actual meat tissue? But we couldn't, obviously, because we can't detect it. But it is good news in that it's not residual in meat that's going to slaughter. Just to clarify some of a question I often get is, they get it from inhaling. They get Pimelea poisoning just from inhaling it. And it was previously thought that the main route of toxin uptake was through direct inhalation directly into the lungs. But what they found was that they actually have to be under 3 microns to be inhaled directly into the lungs. And Mary's analysis of dust that was associated with Pimelea plant material showed that there were very small levels of toxin, except when that dust was contaminated by visible plant material, which is more than 3 microns. So any inhaled plant material that an animal does inhale is transported basically by the nasal mucosa into the throat and then into the gut, along with other ingested material. So it does not reach the lungs directly. And inhalation was also excluded in the feeding trial, and the clinical signs of diarrhoea and edema did develop, so that also supported that it is ingestion that's the main source of toxin. Okay, we might be able to hear from Richard again shortly, but I'll just give a summary of some of the work that Richard did. All basically found that all Pimelea species have a very strong and complex seed dormancy, and that fresh seed of all species is difficult to germinate. Survival of the seeds in the paddock is unclear, but it seems to be at least several years. Results from the weathering trial that I spoke about earlier with those little mesh bags indicate that the seed viability fluctuates over time, but does remain higher if the seed is buried. So the surface seed mightn't last quite as long as the buried stuff. And that all of the 3 Pimelea species we've been talking about germinate and establish best in the mild weather, so hence they respond really well to cooler weather rain. Trichostachya and elongata also persist through a wet summer, so they can make it through. Those plants that germinate late in the previous season can make it through if they've got a wet summer if they've had a late spring germination. And we started talking about this before with Tony's question, but all species do like disturbed areas and don't grow well in dense timber or shade. So we've found with some of the Gidgee country, for instance, and I'm sure with some of the other timber, the box type country as well, that you'll find them growing more away from the timber and the shade. Richard also did some herbicide trials. So his work focused particularly on just being able to establish hospital paddocks in southern areas of Queensland. So just being able to have an option of, if you've got Pimelea all over the place, to try and establish some hospital paddocks. So that was the focus of the herbicide research. The sprays that Richard and his team actually trialled did stop the plants flowering and cause browning of foliage. So they did have an effect, but currently no herbicides are registered for Pimelea control. However, if there was sufficient demand for use of an effective herbicide, it does require an application for a minor use permit. And anyone that probably want to know a little bit more about that, I'd encourage you to talk to Richard directly about that. Richard, did you want to add anything or clarify anything, or do any participants like to ask Richard a question?
Richard here, I've got nothing to add. Jenny, you've said it all.
Thanks, Richard. I do have a question from Geraldine. Geraldine, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question?
That's right now, isn't it? Jenny, I was just wondering, how long has Pimelea been so prevalent? Graham has been here a long while, and when and it's only in the last maybe 10, 15 years that we've had problems with Pimelea, and it just suddenly is something that has appeared. Has anyone else had that problem?
Geraldine, yeah, good question. I remember it being an issue on a few properties in 88, 89, I think. What happens, and Richard, I'll hand this over to you shortly, but I'll just say really quickly in summary, I think what happens is it is a combination of a number of dry summers and then a number of wet winters, and I guess that the last 10 years we've seen a lot of that happen, but I'm sure it has happened in the past as well, and I can remember 88 when it actually happened. It probably has been occurring, but maybe not in so many years following on from each other. Like it happened for 4 or 5 consecutive years there during 2005. Richard, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I agree that that run of bad years has exacerbated the problem. It has been around for forever. The things that have encouraged its greater prominence these days is, A, we've got a lot more cattle rather than sheep, and sheep are not as significantly affected by it. B, it likes open country, as Jenny said, and therefore anywhere where we've cleared timber is giving it a chance. Other activities like blade ploughing and so on to control woody regrowth will also give it a chance to get established in barer areas, disturbed areas where it might have only been isolated plants before. So there is a combination of things, but it's I think that's about the best way of explaining it.
Thank you, Richard. That makes a lot of sense. Melody, you would like to ask a question?
Yeah, if we spray, we've got it in patches it seems to be just about in every paddock, but if we spray it in a paddock, do you need to keep cattle out of that paddock for a period of time while the spray is on there?
It'll depend what you're spraying it with, but I will hand that one back to Richard.
There are withholding periods on most herbicide sprays that are around. They are only short periods of time, and we've seen no evidence that spraying the plants with the herbicide increases the attractiveness of the plants to the cattle if they did happen to wander into that area. But the withholding periods for a lot of these things is only about 7 days.
Okay.
The other thing, of course, about spraying, you'll kill those plants, but you won't kill, with the herbicides that we've trialled, you won't kill any seed that's still in the soil. They can still.
So is there a benefit in spraying, or is burning, or are you going to go into that later on?
Spraying, it's got to be a pretty big effect and a special purpose, really, to make it economic.
Yep.
But, if, for instance, in the Maranoa, if you've got a fallowed paddock with a lot of bare ground, the Pimelea can often get very dense there. and you might be able to get a very good knockdown with an appropriate timing with a spray that many of the hormone sprays like 2,4-D and MCPA and dicamba do quite a good job on.
It seems to me that we have it in patches, but there seem to be, the more I write about and what have you, there are patches around a lot of the property. So is it suitable to do just patches? Is there a benefit in doing it, or is there a better way to try and get rid of it?
It will tend to occur in patches in most areas. It likes areas that are a little bit damper, roadsides, little low spots, creek and gully frontages, that sort of area. And if you wanted to spray those because you've got, there's only a little bit in the paddock, by all means, I think you could probably do quite a good job. Your spray that'll kill the Pimelea will kill all the other herbage, but it won't kill grass. So that if the grassy paddock, you'll just kill the Pimelea and a bit of the other herbage.
Then I guess you just have to hope that the seed isn't going to be, that your cattle aren't going to be eating the seed.
Yeah, cattle taking in the seed from the soil is not likely to be that common.
Right.
The fact that it's in patches is also an indication that it's a little bare patch or a barer patch, and that's the message I'm getting from people I've been talking to recently. They say, well, yes, it's there, but it's only obvious most of the time in places that are already bare as a result of sort of whatever the past 5 years of drought have done or been disturbed or whatever.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. And Kay, you have a question?
Yeah, just following on, the point was made earlier that the seed can remain viable for a variable period of time. So, Richard, would it be safe to assume that if someone does decide that there's a particular area or areas that they'd like to use a herbicide treatment on to try and control it for a longer term benefit, that they would have to have an expectation at the outset of, spraying over some number of consecutive years, e.g. 3+? Is that, have you drawn that sort of conclusion? Like, it's certainly not just a one-off because of the seed that's going to stay in the soil.
Yeah, correct. You'd have to be prepared to do follow-up. And, of course, one of the cheaper follow-ups might also be just to make sure that you do everything to encourage the most vigorous pasture growth that you can have to compete against it, because it doesn't germinate well in a dense grassy or even dense herbage. It doesn't germinate well when there's plenty of other cover, but once it has germinated, then the herbage or other grass in spring, for instance, when it warms up, can come away and the Pimelea's already got its head start, and it won't be seriously affected by the competition at that stage.
Thank you, Richard. I just wanted to highlight that some of you have probably seen this publication. It is available. If you want a hard copy, just contact one of us. Contact me, jenny.milson at dd.qld.gov.au, and I can send you one. Otherwise, if you go to this site here, you can download a copy of the book. So you can either give me a call for a hard copy, or you can download your own. And that just, basically it looks at a lot of these things that we've spoken about this afternoon, but also looks at a lot of the management implications and some things that might help you with decision making. Okay, so what are some of those management considerations? I guess one of the main things is know what Pimelea looks like. There is some confusion often when it's smaller, and some of the other little plants can look a bit like it at some stages, but really clarify to know what it looks like. And keenly observe your pastures, particularly after those winter rains, the cooler season rains. Have a good look around for what's there. If you do notice that green Pimelea is coming up, it's often possible to graze that country. Stock may need to be moved once the pastures dry out, but the key thing is to keep an eye on those stocks constantly. And just be alert for any of the first occurrences of diarrhoea or edema or any of that jugular vein distension. I know there are a number of producers who have learnt to live with Pimelea, and they really just keep an eye as they notice the plant when it comes up. They still run their stock in there, providing they're not hungry stock. They don't sort of unload cattle straight off, adjustment cattle that have been away and they've been on trucks for a couple of days. They don't unload them straight onto it. But stock that are local and have been in the area and growing in the area, They'll leave them on usually, but they just are really diligent about keeping an eye on those stock. And if you notice any of those clinical signs, then stock must be moved pretty much immediately to Pimelea-free areas, because the animals in those earlier stages of poisoning really do usually recover. And I touched on it just before. I'll mention it too. I haven't got a dot point here unless it's on the next slide. Just about young cattle. If you've got young cattle that aren't that are coming from a new area, or in fact cattle coming from any other area, it's really good to be extra diligent with those. It seems that some of the local animals may be a little bit more or a bit less susceptible. So, and maybe it's for the reason, like we were talking about before, that they are maybe getting some adaptation of rumen microflora that can handle the simplex and more effectively than animals who haven't been exposed to it before. So just keeping those couple of things in mind. And if possible, keeping Pimelea-free paddocks in reserve if you possibly can. And again, there are some producers in this area that specifically do that. And they make sure they're in good condition for in case they have to move animals who are being affected. And just, providing water sources that aren't contaminated with Pimelea debris, raised water troughs and that sort of thing. If you've got Pimelea in paddocks, getting your animals to drink off water troughs rather than out of little dams that are fed by gullies where Pimelea may be growing. But they're the basics. It really is an observation thing and adapting to your own situation as the time comes.
The question was about in situations where people do have the opportunity to move cattle around and not continually graze for extended periods. From memory, that the pen trial, it was 35 days before clinical signs started to appear. Is that correct?
That was the first one, and that was on that fairly low dose.
Yeah. Okay.
Remember that was a low dose.
I'm just wondering if there's something that, some conclusion you can draw that if you do have to graze affected paddocks and you're concerned about it, rather than if you don't want to wait until you see the first signs, if, for example, leave them in there for 3 weeks and then move them into another paddock, and then you might bring them back again later. I mean, is there some sort of recommendation that you can draw from it?
There's not a general recommendation that I can give. I can't speak for Mary or Richard, because each situation is going to be different in terms of toxin content, how much they are eating of it. The thing is, often they're avoiding it altogether, especially if it's different heights and it's not mixed through with feed. But you're right, Kay, and I think people would probably learn what works for them. But yeah, what we've found is that it's not always consistent, and I think it's probably because the appearance of the plant isn't consistent through the paddock from year to year, and also probably at different stages of the plant it's going to have different toxin levels as well. So I'd just be very cautious in saying give it 3 weeks and then move them, because I don't know, they might hook into a whole lot in the first week and start showing signs after that first week. But I guess what you're saying is that a lot of properties can probably develop their own timelines from what usually happens. I haven't given you a definite prescription because I don't feel confident to do that. Thanks, Kay. Melody?
Can you tell me, is there benefit in burning? Is it something that if you can get a good fire over it, you can gradually
I'll refer that one to Richard, who's got his hand up for something else. He might have wanted to say something else. But I think you had a comment about burning, Richard, and I can't remember exactly what it was. I don't think it is. I don't think it does work terribly well. Is that correct?
Yeah, we can't recommend burning as a way of reducing the problem. It'll certainly burn the plant and burn some of the seeds, but the burning also creates a bareness in the pasture, which, if rain was to follow in a coolish time, which would be the sort of time when you'd be more likely to be burning anyway in cooler weather, you might just expose yourself to an even worse problem.
Bigger problem.
Some of the earlier feeding trial stuff that was done back in the 70s, where they gave animals fairly significant doses, they produced very severe symptoms within a few days if animals were taking in a fair amount of Pimelea. So I would be very hesitant to talk about putting them in for a couple of weeks and then thinking about moving them. I think depending on, of course, on whether they take to eating the Pimelea, depending on how used they are to it, I think they could get a very significant and very severe dose quite quickly if they eat a reasonable amount of it.
Thank you, Richard. That's a good comment.
Yes, Richard, I was going to make a comment on those. It's also with animals that are used to it. There's the rumen metabolism, but there's also animals that know to avoid it, I guess. So there's a big difference between stock that have been in the area, who clearly seem to recognise it and can live with it, as opposed to if you bring new stock in, you are likely to get poisoning within a very short period of time. So those are certainly the ones that have to be more watched.
Thank you very much, Mary, for highlighting that. And Richard, I guess the trial animals, when you think about that picture, they were just getting a couple of very small plants a day. So yes, if they were taking a lot in, then it would affect them a lot more quickly. So thank you very much for clarifying that, Mary and Richard. Just quickly to summarise, the project did finish after we were given a bit of a continuation, so we were lucky to do that. I guess what we'd like to obtain funding to do to maintain targeted field surveys, so it'd be great to be able to keep doing some of the stuff in the field that we've been doing in the past. It'd be great to employ a chemist and or rumen ecologist to do further analysis, particularly relevant to the rumen microflora, and to have resources to allow follow-up of any suspected field cases and look at post-mortems and correlated field sampling just to gain some further information and maybe test the rumen biology theory. So if anyone knows of any spare money floating around, I'm sure that we could use it. And Pimelea this year, I guess I'm pretty well finished now, but it's just to summarise that, all three species seem to be growing in many areas this year, but I haven't personally heard of a lot of poisoning. I've heard of a couple of cases, and I know of some producers who've had to move cattle that are showing clinical signs, and they've adapted to that. And I guess I was just going to end the formal part now and ask Richard and Mary if they'd like to comment any further, or whether we've got time for any participant observations, or whether we need to close up fairly quickly, Greg. But thank you all very much for listening. I can't tell if you're going to sleep or not. That's one good thing about these things. But for your participation as well, and particularly to Mary and Richard for being here to answer the curly questions.
Yeah, not so much a question. What we have found is that where we've identified that we've got a problem, we've put the beast in the yard and we've fed it things like barley and loose and hay, that sort of pretty high protein for a little while, and then put it back in a paddock that we believe is fine, and perhaps kept feeding it, and we've had great success. Now, that's probably not practical with a lot of cattle, but for just odd beasts that you notice that are affected, that's worked very well for us. Okay.
The vets tell us that giving them the high-protein diet and whatever is very good for just stimulating the rumen function. So, because the toxin will actually knock out a lot of the bacteria and things in there, so you just need to get it going again. So feeding it the high-protein diet is consistent with that. We treated one bull with 2 injections over 2 days of, I think it was aminoplex or something like that the vet gave us, and he's been fine and continued to work really well for us for 2 seasons so far. So it's not something that you'd be able to do for a major herd, but for odd beasts it does work, and you can get them on the truck then and get them out of there. So that has been successful. We'll do whatever we can to get rid of it, but it seems from what you're saying that it's perhaps not so easy to get rid of, and we might have to learn to live with it a bit.
Probably is. I didn't actually mention, and it's not relevant for a lot of you, I suppose. Some people have managed it by actually stocking sheep in a paddock. Now, it can affect sheep if they eat it green, but they don't have the smooth muscle they don't appear to have the same smooth muscle in the lung venules that cattle do, so they're not affected by the full-blown St. George disease. But there's a producer who was actually in the case study in the book who if he had Pimelea coming up, he'd get a mob of sheep, and while they didn't eat it, they worked that country, and the cattle then didn't work the Pimelea country as much as other areas, and he found it really successful. So you're right, Melody, I suppose we do have to learn how to live and manage with it, but they're always, if we ask ourselves the right questions, it's funny some of the answers we can come up with for specific properties.
Is there any, have you done anything at all with horses in Pimelea?
There was one case, and I don't know much about it, but from the Roma area where there were horses affected. Was it Roma or South Australia, Mary? Do you?
No, it was Roma, because it was...
it was Roma.
Yeah, it was the DPI officers out there who had reported it. It basically had the full-blown St. George disease with the fluid accumulation and everything. But it's not very common with horses. That's the only one case we've heard of.
So you would suggest that it's unpalatable, so horses wouldn't graze it if they had a choice?
They certainly wouldn't graze it if they had a choice.
Yep.
I think we could say that fairly confidently. They would not graze it, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Melody.
Jenny, Tony Hamilton.
Yes, Tony.
Could I ask Richard a question about sheep? I just wanted to know whether there is many sheep affected by Pimelea at this stage that he knows of.
I'm unaware of any confirmed cases with sheep. We do have one case out in the Bollen area with Sam sheep, where the owner suspected that the animals might have been suffering from Pimelea poisoning. But as best I know, they did a post-mortem and an autopsy, sent away lab samples and so on, and it came back virtually not confirming. They couldn't rule it out, but they reckoned that there was nothing that they could find that would give them a confident diagnosis of Pimelea poisoning.
Thank you.
Jenny, it's Greg. One of the questions come up through the chat line, is there any problems with goats?
Not that I know of. And I have heard people who actually help to manage their Pimelea with goats, but I'd ask Mary or Richard if they have heard differently, but as far as I know, goats don't seem to be affected. At least they may get some effect from the green plant, so they may get some of the intestinal irritation, but not that I know of in the full-blown St. George disease kind of signs. Mary?
Yeah, that's my recollection too, Jenny, that it's to do with this smooth muscle that the cattle have, which is peculiar to the cattle, that constricts their pulmonary arteries. That's where it pumps the blood to the heart. So if the animals don't physically have that, then they don't suffer the St. George syndrome. And my recollection is that's only from cattle, not in sheep and goats. Although they didn't think this, they thought the same was true about horses, but there's been the occasional case in horses. So I guess if they eat enough of it, perhaps they can.
Yeah, hi, it's Narelle. Just wanted to know, do Pimelea affected cattle sometimes have a cough as part of their symptoms?
I'm not sure about that one. It's not something that is common, I don't think, but that's not to say that an individual animal that's affected might not also show that clinical sign. So I haven't answered your question. It's not a common. We don't sort of see an animal coughing and think it's got Pimelea poisoning.